the Danvers Marvelous Company. We are Revolutionary War reenactors that operate this site. Don here is one of our board members. He's been very excited to share this information. He's been working on this for a while, and we want to share the history of our group and our organization, and about the revolution, especially for Rev 250 kicking off this year. So welcome, Don Hayes.
There we go. Well, I'm going to be a little bit inauthentic. I'm going to wear these. My militia glasses don't have the most recent prescription, and I can't see my notes without them. So, who am I? As Catherine said, I'm an active member of the Danvers Alarm List Company. I'm a charter member. I served 10 years as lieutenant, and now I'm the recruiting officer. And yes, there will be an advertisement about recruiting somewhere along the line, and soldiers will be stationed at the doors to keep you from leaving. Let's see, 50 years teacher and professor of history. So I've had some time at this. Why am I doing the research? Well, the first thing is that the big 249th anniversary we had in Arlington this past April, I heard some things from various people, and I thought, I've never heard that before, or that isn't quite what I've heard before, and I began to get curious. I mean, after 50 years, you'd think I'd know better. So I wanted to find out, my own curiosity. By the way, is there anybody here from the Arlington Historical Society? Excellent. I want to talk with you later. Because I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Matt has contacted me.
I haven't actually heard his last name
Okay.
because he's new to us, but I heard
Right.
Barris.
Good, Barris, yeah. And the Arlington Historical Society wants me to cooperate with them, and I'm happy to do so because I think we need to get the story out about the Battle of Menotomy. The most active time in that day was in Menotomy, not Lexington and Concord, and not later on down towards Charlestown. So it is the most significant fighting of the day, and it's unknown even by people in Arlington. We were talking to people from Arlington on that day that we had the reenactment, and they had no idea. I'd like to talk to their curriculum coordinator for the 4th grade. And the fighting, sorry?
It's not on MCAS, they don't care.
The fighting shows emphatically just how the population felt, not just in Menotomy, but also in all of eastern Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire, northern Connecticut. People responded from all those areas on that day, and of course ended up bottling up the regular army in Boston after they had retreated to that spot. Now, methods of research that I'm using is rather standard. The first thing you do is read all the available literature, and that's about where I am right now. The next step is to go and to find the original source documentation which backs all this up. And then there are questions that arise as you go through all this, and you have to track them down as well. And I'll mention a few as we go along. So this is a report on work done so far. There's more to come, believe me. My focus presently, of course, is on Danvers and its participation. The first thing I had to decipher is how many companies of people, of men, came from Danvers. And some sources say 5, some say 7. I've seen one as high as 11. So what I've had to do is to go through each one of these sources and see where they got their information from and sort of figure out what's going on. I wanted to know where their deployment was. Where did they fight in Menotomy? They couldn't fit 300 guys into Jason Russell's front yard. It's not possible. Plus the men who died there from Danvers and Lynn and other places, so there were just more than just Danvers was there. So you have to have another deployment. And then what happened after the battle? So I'm looking into all these things. My focus is on Danvers, but I will be at the same time looking at monotony, because some very unusual incidences, come on in, occurred at that time that I think are worth sharing. First thing I want to talk about is vocabulary. The Army was not the British. Everybody in 1775 was British. British colonials, British Army, everybody was English. So there was no such thing as Paul Revere running around saying the British are coming. He did not say that. He said the regulars are out. The regular army wore red coats, not this color. It was a brick red, by the way. This is a civilian-style coat, and it's a color that civilians wore. And by the way, this is floppy, and that's appropriate for my age in my late 70s. And gentlemen of the late 70s in 1774 wore an older style, just as we do today. We don't wear what the younger guys wear today. So we have a little bit of an argument with certain reenactors about this, and of course they lose. The people living in this colony, Massachusetts Bay Colony, were rebels. They were not patriots. We do not become patriots until July the 4th, 1776, because then we are fighting for a country. Right now we are rebels. We are English citizens, subjects really of the king, who are in open rebellion against the army, our army. Now imagine for yourself getting some old firearms left over from World War II that have been hanging around in the barn or a shed, fixing them up and going out and fighting the United States Army or the National Guard. I don't think would go over very well. And using the vocabulary reminds us just how serious this was. We were in rebellion here in Massachusetts Bay Colony. We were threatening our own lives. What happens to those who commit treason? Right. You are executed in one way or another. So Danvers in 1774-75 was a seacoast town allied with Salem, which had been around for a longer time than many other communities, and so therefore was more prosperous as an economy than inland towns like Lexington and Concord, which were still, well, Lexington was a place where drovers drove their flocks through and to bring them to Boston. So the clothing styles, the economic health of the community was different. That affects the clothing styles that we've had our differences with other outfits that come from further west. Monotony, to begin this, Revere drives right through Monotony. Doesn't drive, he rides through Monotony. And they have reenacted this over and over again. And about 2 p.m. they get word that, 2 a.m., sorry. They get word that Percy's, Lord Percy is the relief force for Lieutenant Smith, who has gone through and gone to Lexington, fired at Lexington, gone to the North Bridge. He's on his way back, and he's getting beaten up by the Americans, the rebels, who are pretty unhappy with the actions of the army. And finally, Grant comes up and meets Percy in Lexington, and Percy's fresh troops. He has about 1,000 guys with him. Smith had about 800 initially. So they try to protect the army and bring it back. And the interesting thing, just a side comment, if you read the depositions of the British officers, the regular army officers, about the fighting at Lexington and Concord, there's a great deal of covering your behind because it was a mistake. Not that it was their mistake only, because they had orders to do that right from London. But when you read Percy's comments about the Battle at Monotony, he's quite honest, because what he is trying to do is to preserve this army and get it back to safety. So when he talks about for example, the ring of fire that his army experienced right from Lexington all the way through Menotomy, all the way into Charlestown. The colonials, the rebels, surrounded them, and if they fired from the side and the army went by, they got in behind and they fired at the rear guard. So there are people before them, around, beside them, and behind them firing. And he describes his surprise at how determined the rebels were. And this tells us that the British Army, the British government, our government at the time, underestimated us completely, which is what often happens with people in political power anywhere at any time. So, Percy is trying to get initially from Boston to meet Smith. He comes to a bridge that has been torn up, but the planks are there. He puts the planks back, or the men do, or they cross over. But the wagons in the supply train are very heavy, and so the bridge needs to be reinforced. So by the time they get across, there's quite a separation between Percy and his soldiers and his supply train. A messenger comes from brain blank, Cambridge. From Cambridge to Menotomy and says the supply train's on the way. So a few of the old timers, what we would call members of the alarm company, who are exempt from actually being in the army or in the fight with the other rebels, they gather together and they choose a gentleman as their leader who happens to be a mulatto. They choose one of the strongest and best men that they know. And that indicates to me, and we should all remember that there were African descent people and mixed race people engaged in the American Revolution. And this puts a lie to the statement of the future Confederates that this was a country built for the white man only. It was not built by the white man for the white man. It was built by all people for all people. And it even started here in Menotomy. So what they do is they get across the street from the meeting house and hide down. There's a ditch and a wall. Somebody's digging a ditch along the road, and of course you put the dirt up on the land right next to it, so you end up with a nice barricade. So you hide down there. When the wagons came across them, they popped up, pointed their muskets at the drivers and the few soldiers that were there and demanded a surrender. Well, the drivers whipped the horses, so what did? They shot the horses and killed them. That stopped the wagons dead. They also hit a couple of the soldiers, and 3 more were captured. In fact, eventually they surrendered. They run off down to Spy Pond, and 2 of them throw their musket in. One of them uses a stone wall and bends the musket so it's not usable. And then they go and they find an elderly woman who is digging dandelions, because you can eat dandelions, and they surrender to her. Sadly, I can't remember her name, but she takes them to a local captain's house, and someone says to these men, when you get back to England, be sure to tell King George that you surrendered to an old lady. Now, Danvers collects its men. The rider comes through here around 9 a.m., and I think I have figured out who the companies were and what they were. And one of the reasons of the miscounting is that 3 of the regiments of the companies here were a part of the Essex Regiment. They were not strictly town, they were also Essex Regiment. And then there is the case that Captain Israel Hutchinson's, his men meet at the Bell Tavern. They're from New Mills. They go to Bell Tavern, and the men from Beverly, there's a company from Beverly coming through at the same time, so they join up with Israel Hutchinson's men. So some people count that as 2 companies, but I don't count it as 2 companies. I count it as a company for Beverly and 1 company for Danvers, to keep that clear. So we have Captain Israel Hutchinson's with 53 Minutemen. Captain Gideon Foster, now his men, he was made a captain only the end of March, and it isn't even in the state records because this all happened too quickly. But 30 men from Epps's, another company, Captain Epp's company, become Minutemen. Again, it's the youngest guys, the Minutemen with the young guys, like I'm not, and up like 16 to 30 roughly. And the militiamen were 30 to about 60, and anybody over 60 was considered to be alarm list and could be exempt if they had to be. Interestingly now, the Danvers Alarm List Company is populated mostly by alarm list aged people. As our lieutenant says, we're living up to our name. But we have recruited some younger men. So now we have some Minutemen finally. So Foster's has 30 men, and he also joins up Hutchinson at Bell Tavern. And Captain Caleb Lowe of Militia has 23 men from the southern part of town. Those companies move out at 10 a.m. They're Minutemen. They don't need to wait for permission from anybody. That's their job. Move out. Caleb Lowe, he has his own opinion and he moves out. Typical Yankee, right? So Captain Samuel Epps of the Essex Militia goes and rides into Salem and gets permission from Colonel Timothy Pickering to go. The other two militia companies, or I should say Essex militia companies, don't do that. When Epps leaves, so do they. Permission from one is permission from all. We have Captain Samuel Flint of the Essex Militia, Captain Jeremiah Page of the Essex Militia. His son does not join his group. His son joins, I think, Foster's group. Captain Asa Prince is militia, and then we have the two alarm list companies captained by two Putnams, Edmund and John. And they're from the north part of town. Some people come from Putnamville and Beaver Brook, some from the training field, some from Danvers Plains. They come from all over the town. They all follow the same route as the Lynn companies. The Lynn companies had left an hour or so earlier, but what's interesting is there were over 300 men, boys of 15 up to grandfathers. At the Bell Tavern, Reverend Nathan Holt gets into this and gives them a blessing. The same thing happens at the training field with Reverend Wadsworth. One of the Army's men said that the regiment, the black-robed regiment, was as effective in fighting as any man with a soldier or any soldier or a musket, because they were the ministers who exhorted people, talked about it on Sundays, and really fired people up. I wish ministers did that today, don't you? Benjamin Pierce. Let's see, wait a minute, now we got things out of order. Oh my goodness. Is this still working? Come on. Those are my granddaughters, in case you're wondering. Now we get to monotony. I have to go around the... So, this is how the Danvers militia comes in. This is the road to Medford, and by the way, the Danvers people have friends in Medford. That's where a lot of them spend the night after the battle. This is the area that I believe the Danvers companies were deployed. This is the meeting house. This is Jason Russell's house. And I don't know if you can see the green dots. I misspelled the word tenths, but it's 2/10 of a mile from the house to the meeting house. This is the orchard. Even in Jason Russell's grandfather's day, there was an orchard, and it is recorded he sold a piece of the orchard to the minister for his house. So this is where men were behind trees. This is used by a couple of guys when the flankers come out and attack them. They run through the orchard towards Spy Pond to get away from the battle. There was a brook in those days, it no longer exists. So this is where the Danvers men were. So why were they here? Well, the Lynn men got there first and were probably over here, but that's something I've got to research. There were men from Needham and Stoneham and all other towns and communities in this area, but I only focused on where Danvers was at that time. And I found some mentions about where they were. This is, I used the geographic information to find out, here's the hill. It's 163 feet tall today. I don't know what it was then. But the British, or the Army, I should say, skirted along here. The commander, well, Percy was smart enough to know how to handle the situation. The problem was when he gets to Menotomy, there's too many obstructions. The idea was you walk your main route down the marching down the road. You have flankers come out. These are the young men, again, more agile and can move faster. And they sweep along the side, clearing out anybody who's hiding there and trying to fire at you. That works from Lexington down to the foot of the rocks, which is an area of height here. And when he gets to there, he says he looked down and recognized he was going to have a problem because this is where the town was. This is where buildings were. So the flankers had too many obstructions. Plus, the territory here drops down because there is a brook there and a mill, and Ammi Cutter lives here. He's one of the men mentioned in this little book published by the Arlington Historical Society, a very, very important resource. I'll talk more about that later. But this becomes difficult. You can't sweep anybody out of here because you're down in a gully, and they can shoot down on you. So this is the one area that they can get a flanking party. The Danvers men have put themselves along the wall here. Deployed. That Hutchinson has warned them and said, you don't want to be up against the wall. He's had experience in the French-Indian War. So some of them go in the trees, but many of them stay along the wall, particularly the ones here in the yard. And this is where the battle is, the most desperate battle is. Let's see. I got my pages here. Here we go. So, words drop and train to burn. There we go. So, the battle at in this area here, Samuel Page, the son of Captain Page of Essex Militia, he reports he and the men here fired 2 good volleys, which forced the army to stop dead in their tracks, which makes them a sitting target. And as he is trying to reload, he breaks his ramrod and he turns to Pearly Putnam, another Minuteman, probably about 18. We're not quite sure. I've seen mentions where he was 22, but he was a young man. And he turns to Pearly and says, can I use your ramrod? And at that point, Pearly is shot by a flanker, the first firing of the flanker, and drops dead at his feet. So Page takes off and runs through the trees this way and keeps the trees between him and himself and the, nope, that isn't supposed to happen. There we go. Let's see. Yeah, Pern's the right runs of the arch. Then in the action in the yard, Jotham Webb is a brickmaker, 20 days married. He wore his wedding suit, and supposedly, and I haven't tracked this down, but I will, if I die, I must die in my best clothes. Pearly, Putnam, and Webb were in Hutchinson's company. So Hutchinson's being a Minuteman company and Foster's being a Minuteman company were deployed this area, and the other companies would be further down. And there's even some speculation that not all the companies from Danvers made it to that point. They may have fought further down because the alarm companies, like ourselves, would move a little slower. Let's see. Samuel Cook of Southern Danvers, yeah, he was a Minuteman. Benjamin Deland of Southern Danvers. Ebenezer Galwaith, Henry Jacobs Jr., and Reuben Kennison of Ryleside, Beverly. He was shot and repeatedly bayoneted. He had joined Hutchinson's in New Mills. He lived closer to the Danvers line than he did to the meeting point in Beverly. We saw this happen. people acted on their own. Jason Russell, poor man, was shot twice and bayoneted in his own dooryard. Now, the story about Jason Russell is rather interesting. I can't tell you exactly what he is supposed to have said because I found 3 different quotes. The quote that's in this book, and this is where we get into the lore part of my title. There's a lot of information in here, but it's lore, not documented information. The Samuel Abbott Smith did a great job, quite frankly. He was, the ministers were, somebody had the idea of the ministers giving speeches about various parts of the town history. He chose this one and he talked to everybody he could. The only problem is there was one person left who was an eyewitness by 1864. She was in her 90s, Mrs. Lydia Pierce. And I can't remember her maiden name off the top of my head. The problem with her is that she was either 10 or 12 or 14 years old when this happened. She was among the women and children who were taken off up the hill to, I think it's the Pierce house. And they were all housed there, so she didn't actually see anything. But of course she knew everybody and heard all the stories, heard the reports. So that's fine, except that I know from experience with my own family, when you get into your 90s, your memory changes. My mother taught me who was in a particular picture. She's my great-great-grandmother. Her husband fought in the Civil War. And when my mother was in her late 80s, she came to me and said, I don't know who this is. So I told her, she said, I don't know who this is. And she went and put it somewhere. And I thought, oh, I'll never find it, you know. And then actually a few months later, she says, you've got to find that picture of Eliza. I said, where'd you put it? I don't know. So you have to be careful with these kinds of things. He also talked to grandsons, granddaughters who had the family history come down that way. There's always a kernel of truth in it, though. You can't deny it completely. You just have to be wary of how it may have changed over time. So Jason Russell, according to Amy Cutter, said one of 2 things. Depends upon who you read and find out. And the first one, the long one, is an Englishman's home is his castle, and I am a good subject of King George III, and I have nothing to fear from this army. I discount that because he moved his wife and grandson away from the potential problems and then went back to keep an eye on his house. Why would he do that if he had that kind of confidence in the army? The one that is generally quoted and is quoted in here is that an Englishman's home is his castle, and I'm not going to leave it. That makes sense. Then I found a third source with something completely different altogether. I can't remember what it was, but it had no connection to this one. So we're dealing here with some storytelling or some complete fiction. We don't know which. I doubt the Amy Cutter versions are complete fiction, to be honest with you. Because Amy Cutter was his neighbor across the way. Cutter said, you got to come to and give yourself some safety. And he said, no, I'm going to stay. Which he did, and of course it cost him his life, the poor man. So, Battle of Russell's House. All right, don't need that. In other action, let's see, Benjamin Pierce was a Salem baker who rode his horse, independent of any other company. He just came to fight. And unfortunately, he was killed as he was running across a field, shot by the army. Captain Gideon Foster and others from Lynn and Needham. Now there's 2 more towns we have to look into. What companies did they send? How many? And so on. They were trapped. They had the army to their right and they had the flankers to their left. So where did they go? This way. But this is a little bit inaccurate, of course, because it's my hand-drawn map. But they skirted along the edge here and found themselves sort of trapped between the army again and now the pond. So they took a very brave act and crossed the road directly in front of the army to the other side where the ditch was. and from there they fired at the Army. But I think that was a very brave move. Nathan Putnam was wounded in the upper arm. He's Pearlie Putnam's brother, and I used to represent him when I was his age, but I'm not anymore. He loses his musket because his arm is injured and he probably can't carry it now. And he advertises for it. And we have a picture of that, but I don't have it with me, but there is a picture of that advertisement. In the house, some of the men went into the house for safety. 8 Beverly men found the stairs, which were not in the traditional place, right opposite the front door. It was around the corner. They get down in there, and a British soldier or a member of the army tries to go down. They killed him by shooting up the stairs at him. And I thought, what kind of a fool is that? You got 8 guys down there with muskets, you're going to go down the stairs? Well, anyway. So Daniel Townsend enters the sign door, cannot find the cellar. He goes through the window and is killed. He has a wife and 5 kids. Timothy, with Daniel, follows through the window, runs. He's shot at 34 times, gets a leg wound, and still survives. 3 men who were caught in there are, Abednego, that's the name I have here, Abednego Ramsdell, William Flint, and Thomas Hadley are all killed in the house. Action from upstairs. There are 3 Danvers men upstairs. They're taken prisoner. Dennis Wallace, George Southwick, and Joseph Bell. But somebody takes a sword and cuts Southwick's head in half. Wallace, seeing this, takes off like a shot and gets shot at 12 or 13 times. He is wounded, so he does the smart thing. He falls down dead, and they leave him for dead. But he isn't dead, he survives. Joseph Bell was lucky. He was taken prisoner aboard the prison ship Lively in Boston Harbor, and in June he is exchanged. So all the Danvers men killed or wounded were from Hutchinson's or Foster's companies. Now, a couple of interesting stories. Samuel Whitmore of Menotomy. I love this guy because he was in his 80s, tough old Yankee. He gets out his 2 pistols and his sword, which he obtained from a soldier during the French and Indian War who, quote unquote, suddenly died. And he had a musket. And he goes out, gets himself in a nice safe spot around Cook's Tavern, about 150 yards from the roadway, and waits till something happens, and fires 5 rapid shots. And so a party of 5 are sent out to get him. While they're getting him, he gets them. He fires his pistol twice and gets 2 men, and they do shoot him in the face, knock him out, bayonet him 12 or 13 times. And I meant to bring a bayonet. Bayonet in those days were triangle shape. They weren't flat. So you get cut with a bayonet, you get 3 cuts, not 1. Not 1. So if a surgeon's going to work on you, he has to go way deep inside and sew each one of the 3 all the way up. Because what do you do with a bayonet? You jab it in, you give it a good twist, and you pull it out. So then you don't have any nice, neat 3 cuts. You've got a nice mess on your hands. So let's entertain you with a little bit of a picture here. I love this picture. I'm in it. Can you find me? Yeah, right there. Yeah. I'm the dead man. I always like to do that because one of the reasons we do this is to honor those who were fighting and those who were killed. And I've been killed every time because I feel it's important for the crowd to see that this was not a fun time. This is a fun hobby, but this was not a fun time for the real people. Let's see, Whitmore. His friends find him, Samuel Whitmore. And he's a popular guy, so they want him saved. And one Dr. Tufts, yes, the Tufts of Tufts University. They bring him to him and they say, "You got to save Sam." And Tufts looks at him and says, "No, I'll treat him, but he's going to die." And indeed, he does die, 18 years later. And he brags about his his exploits for the rest of his life. Hezekiah Wyman is another man. I don't know quite where he comes from. He's an older man with white hair. That's how the officers of the army describe him. He's on a white horse. Man, can you see this guy? But he is a crack shot. He rides up as close as he can to them, dismounts, and uses the saddle to steady his musket when he fires, and he rarely ever misses. He rides around, the ring of fire. He's everywhere and nowhere all at once. And he chases them all the way to Charlestown. One of the atrocities, and there were a great many atrocities during all of this, at the Cooper Tavern, the soldiers break in, they go charging, and they did this in all the houses. They went into the houses, killed anybody who was in there, mainly because the rebels were using the houses to fire at them. So naturally, they would burn them, get rid of the obstruction, get rid of the potential firing place for the rest of the army that was coming along. So they go in, and the two owners hide down in the basement. There's a deposition that describes this. But there were two brothers-in-law upstairs, Jason Winship and Jabez Wyman, and they just sort of, they take a lackadaisical viewpoint of the whole thing, and they figure they're going to finish their drinks first, but they're brutally destroyed by the army, and they're not the only ones. The other story that I think is quite interesting is that there was a Hannah Abbott, whose husband was Deacon Abbott, who had been very vocal in opposition to the laws that the Parliament were passing that hurt the economy. But it was also that they took away the rights of trial by jury. Imagine being arrested and being sent to London for trial. I just came back from London. It's a 7-hour flight. Imagine how long it took by ship. And you're not sitting in a very comfortable seat. You're down in the hold, probably in irons during the 6 weeks it takes to get there. And then they try you, and of course you're found guilty. And then you're in a prison in a foreign country, basically, you're far away from your friends and your family. Nobody can support you or help you out. So Hannah Abbott has just given birth to an infant. She's lying abed, and she says in her deposition she can hardly get up and go to the fire to keep wood on it. And these three guys come bursting into her room, and one of them points the bayonet right at her chest. And she hollers out, "Please don't kill me." And one of the other guys says, "Well, we won't kill the woman, but you have to get out of here because we're going to burn the house down." So she crawls out with the infant and a blanket and crawls into a corn crib that's right nearby. And there are 5 kids still in the house, and they set the house afire, which fortunately didn't last too long. There was significant damage, but the kids were unharmed. But that's the kind of thing that was going on. In the aftermath, Elizabeth Russell is quoted in Amos Farnsworth's diary, "There was blood half over her shoes." We've heard other kinds of quotes, but that's one that comes from a diary at the time. Mrs. John Winthrop, in a letter to Mercy Warren, describes witnessing the Danvers men retrieving the bodies of the men. And Joanna Mansfield, who lived on the Boston Road in Lynn, as the Danvers men marched down, Joanna was outside, and she noticed that the Danvers men, for some reason, were wearing gray stockings. Whether it was a town-wide style or whether there was somebody here who made great stockings out of gray, who knows. We wear gray, like I am today, in honor of the men and their supportive families. Let's not forget the women. I understand the Arlington Historical Society is going to have a display that will include the females. Nobody got anywhere without their wives, their children, their sweethearts, their grandparents, their parents. This was a family-oriented society, as it still is. So, she saw the ox cart passing and noticed that the gray stockings of the men who were from Danvers as they went by. 3 of the men went to Hutchinson's house in New Mills, and 4 went to Samuel Cook's in South Danvers. The funeral was held the 21st of April, same year, of course, at South Parish, which is now called Peabody. I've talked about South Parish before, but because of the distance from here to there and the difficulty of getting to church on Sunday, many towns in Massachusetts and across New England broke up into smaller pieces. And that's Peabody. So 2 companies of Salem's 1st Essex Regiment escorted the bodies, but by accident, an impromptu honor guard occurred. The militia of Newburyport, Amesbury, and Salisbury were on their way to Cambridge for the surrounding of the Army in Boston, and they formed an impromptu honor guard on both sides of the street. So, before I go on, it is now time for the advertisement. Particularly for those of you who are listening, I hope, on the television, the younger members. This is a great hobby. It is a lot of fun. You can pretend you're somebody else for a while. It's like taking a mini vacation. You spend a day here on this lovely site in a colonial atmosphere, doing colonial things and thinking about that time period. You forget your own problems and your own concerns, and it's a nice break. Or you go off on a weekend. The initial cost, yes, there's an initial cost, the clothing and the accoutrements, but beyond that, it isn't like golf where you buy an expensive bag of golf clubs and then you have to pay greens fees. Sorry, Bill. Bill plays golf. So does Billy.
If you go to Special Olympics.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and there are other hobbies like that where you have to pay a lot of money. I'm into cars too, so there's insurance and there's excise tax and there's maintenance and all that stuff. But this hobby, once you've done the basic, that's it. It's just gas to get here, food, which we're going to eat anyway, and a good time. And also, during some of the worst times in my life, there's been a weekend. And I go off on the weekend and forget all my problems. And when I get home, I've got a fresher mind and I can deal with them better. So that works too. It's also nice to honor those who are the founders of the nation. And we don't want to forget them. The crowd loves us. I wish I had a nickel for every time I've had my photograph taken. Particularly with somebody wants a picture with the colonial. If I had that nickel every single time in the last 50 years, I'd be as wealthy as Elon Musk. So, do consider joining the hobby. It is not for historians like me, it is for everybody. We have engineers, accountants, just truck drivers, electrical engineers, it's just anybody. It's for fun. So, Danvers Alumnus Company, one of the things we do on Patriots Day, wake up, there we go. This is what I call our marathon of memorials. We know where 6 of the 7 men died. We know where they're buried or where their marker stones are. These 4 men are actually buried under the intersection nearby the cemetery. The cemetery was overtaken by roads. But we do this because this is what Patriots Day is about. It is not about a foot race. It is about people who took and not only lost their lives, but everybody else who was engaged put themselves in jeopardy as treason, as committing treason. And we get little publicity out of it, but that's not the point either. This is us in Peabody because we go from cemetery to cemetery. One of them is a family cemetery way off in the woods. And then Peabody has their memorial because they have the monument that Danvers put up. It's now in Peabody. So the Peabody Historical Society puts on an event as well. And we take part of that. One of the young people I recruited this past spring, when I suggested it to him, he said it would be an honor. He immediately saw the value and the purpose as an honor for recognizing those of us who went before us and made what we have. So that's Danvers Marathon of Memorials. I don't think there's any more. Nope, that's it. Good. So that is the end of my talk. I hope that you've either learned something or been entertained somehow.
Are you available for questions?
Of course. I don't know if I'll have any answers, but I can make them up.
Thank you. How close did you really have to be with revolver for fatal, like an instant fatal situation?
Okay, there were muskets
Okay.
with a smooth bore on the inside.
Yeah.
So the ball, and it was a round lead ball, was only effective for about 90 yards, but you couldn't aim it and get a definite right, like I couldn't shoot that camera.
Right.
It might go to the left, to the right, below, or above, which is why they lined up shoulder to shoulder and fired all at once. Your chances of hitting something were much greater in a group like that. In fact, at Bunker Hill, that's how they got the officers. Groups of guys would say, oh, look, there's a guy on a horse, let's shoot him. And they would all fire at once.
Yeah.
And some would hit him and some wouldn't.
Like 90 yards.
Yeah, the maximum 90 yards, yeah. Because then you start losing velocity and it begins to drop. So,
Are you going to be demonstrating that tonight?
not tonight, no, I'm sorry. We do have events here. If you
Yeah.
keep an eye out on our website, it'll be there too.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I'm from the Linfield Historical Society. We need to outfit maybe 10 guys for April 19th. Where would you suggest getting clothes like that, and is there any rental possibility?
If you do rental, it'll be costume and more like stage play costume, and it would be the wrong material. It won't be wool, it'll be something else. It will look fake.
Yeah, is there any
There are individuals, if you're serious in getting into it, then there are individuals who will do this. I don't think of anybody well, there's the Tory Taylor, for example, but I know, I'm not fond of him either. But there are people, we'd have to sit down with you and talk about that. But everything, these are all handmade. This coat was handmade, and this waistcoat's handmade. This is not. There is a company called, what is it? Townsend, yeah. Townsend Company. They're sort of the Kmart of the colonial world.
Okay.
But the clothing is,
I'm looking for a one-day thing, so.
yeah, for a one-day thing, yeah. We can't loan you anything because we have recruits wearing it right now.
And it's going to be the 18th and 19th, so it's going to be busy.
Yeah, that's true. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
How fast do these groups travel in a given day?
Oh, shame on me for not telling you that the Minutemen companies traveled 16 miles in 4 hours and half the time running. That was Gideon Foster, the captain. That was his statement. As an old man, he said that. He wrote some letters and he made some statements, and that's quite a pace. I don't think the Alarm List Company kept that pace up. And along that route, going that fast, one young man collapsed and died. Probably had a heart failure, a heart flaw, and didn't survive. But yeah, it was quite strenuous. And of course, they were farmers, so they were in better shape than we are. So.
Back in 1976, we reenacted that march to Menominee. And it was a hike. It took us more than 4 hours. And at the end of it, none of us was fit to engage in the battle.
Want to march home?
No, we rode home.
We rode.
Yeah. He's absolutely right. We stopped for lunch at a little park, and that was the worst thing we could do. After marching all that distance to Arlington, we stopped, and we ate. Some of us we all sat down, I think. Then we got up, and we hobbled into Pillais, and when he said, "Forward march," we all went, "Ooh!" Everything had stiffened up.
Yeah.
Well, we hit Mass Ave, when we saw the crowd at the house,
Yep,
you wouldn't have thought we'd march more than that.
yep.
Wait, how many people in here did that march? All right.
20 miles. It ended up being 20 miles.
Yeah. The modern route is 20 miles, it's not 16, because they could go across,
93 in the way.
yeah, they could go across fields and so forth in those days, but we had houses and backyards.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am?
You mentioned that the Danvers regiments were connected to Essex and,
There were 3 companies that were part of the Essex Regiment,
okay,
and the Essex Regiment was under the command of Colonel Timothy Pickering.
okay. Do we know the total number of Danvers men in Menominee on that day?
Not completely, because some of them were taken, like Gideon Foster's company, some of them were taken out of Epps's company. So we have about, Mike came up with a count of 335, plus whatever Gideon Foster had. He came up with a list of about 20 when he was elderly, but we don't think, even the author of the book I read didn't think all the men were there, because 2 or 3 of those who were killed weren't included on any list anywhere. So we're saying between 330, 350,
And
I would say.
you know how a lot of British officers would be on horseback?
Mhm.
Were there any colonial officers on horseback, or were they all on foot? When they
That
were
is a
coming?
good question. There is evidence of some men being on horseback, but generally officers would be on foot. Even the Army's officers got off the horses because they were such great targets, and they marched along too. So.
You were mentioning that was like a group 3 companies that represented the Essex. Was that Danvers, Beverly, and Lynn? Because I know you mentioned Lynn.
No, that was 3 companies from Danvers.
Oh, okay.
There were companies from the other towns too, yeah.
Do you
But-
have any information about the Lynn specifically or not?
Not yet. That's, once you get involved in a research project like this, you go down the rabbit hole like Alice in Wonderland. And it's clear, I think the first thing I want to do is talk with the Allington people and find out more about their organization, because they're the basis, the base of the operation. Then I want to look at Lynn next, because they were a little bit ahead of us, and we had to go through Lynn. Then, of course, the other companies that were there. I'd like to know the names of all the towns that were there and their companies, but that's going to come down the road. This is an ongoing project, like any other one.
So there's a great book, I'm from Linfield, and we were Lynn End at the time. And it's Lynn in the Revolution by a guy named Sanderson. And it's got a biography of every soldier.
Yeah,
And it's a great book, it's a great resource.
yeah. Super. Yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned Dr. Tufts, you mentioned John Winthrop. So is that how the name of the city Winthrop came from him?
Oh, you'd have to look at a Winthrop history for that one, because Winthrop is a common name, really. So it could have been any Winthrop, I don't know. But Tufts is the one at the university, or actually he started the hospital and now it's a university, but he saved Samuel Whitmore, so I guess he had some skill. Whitmore was tough too, gee.
I don't think that's dark enough.
That's, by the way, the man on the right is sitting here. He's one of the great guys. The guy on the left, I'm not so sure about.
It looks like you have your period glasses on there.
I do, yeah, I do. Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Not a question, but a comment. Those of us in Arlington who interpret the Battle of Menominee on the Jason Russell property anyway, would want people to know that of all the people, of all the militia and the Minutemen that died in Menominee, only 3 of them were from Menominee, which speaks to the response to the alarm. And Menominee was a crossroads village, and it still is today. Arlington Center is a very busy intersection. And that allowed them, all the militia companies, to kind of pour in. But it's just really, it's really so many other towns represented there in that battle. not just monogamy?
Well, as the towns marched, you're right, I'm not disagreeing with you. As the towns marched towards the alarm for Lexington and Concord, they got a communication that the Army is now here, the Army is now here, and it just so happened that they converged on Menotomy, and that's why there were so many there. But they were just keeping track, and it was at that point that the Lord Percy decided there was a fork on the road. He could go one way to Cambridge, which is the way he had come, or he could go to Charlestown. And at the last minute, he veered off into Charlestown and fooled all of the colonials and lessened the resistance, shall we say, as they went down to Charlestown. Interestingly enough, Timothy Pickering's name comes up. He did not pull his companies together and go and respond to the alarm the way we would like him to have. He waited, and he actually met them in the Charlestown Road and really didn't do much. So we could have wiped out that entire army, but there were more on the way. The army of the English country was quite large, and in the end they sent more and more, but that army didn't behave itself sometimes. The colony of New Jersey was known to be a loyalist colony. And so General Howe, both the Howes, the Admiral Howe and the General Howe, the brothers, came here. And their idea was to march across New Jersey and raise an army of loyalists to fight on their behalf. But the problem was that as they marched across New Jersey, the behavior of the soldiers, attacking women, attacking men, plundering houses, and the Hessians who were with him were experts at plunder. They stripped everything. You went into your house after they left and there was nothing left, just bare walls. So that convinced people that it was time to turn their way and become rebels. So he made a loyalist colony into a rebel colony. So, well, that should do it.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone for showing up.
Yes.
Just be aware that this 2025 is the start of the Revolution 250 in Massachusetts. The beginning of it was last weekend from the State House. There's going to be events happening for the next 8 years in Massachusetts. We want support for all these events. We're going to have Leslie's Retreat happening in Salem in February. And then we're going to start just going into Lexington, Concord, Menotomy, Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill is going to be in Gloucester this year. So there's all these events that are happening. So look on your website, the Mass 250 website, the Rev 250 website. There's a lot of things happening. We need to get everybody excited. Everybody was excited in 1976. Let's get them going for 2026. So, also like to thank you. The site is provided as you folks don't have to pay tonight. This is a volunteer site. We do everything we do here is on volunteers. Any donations that we can get. We do have a gift shop. If you just want to stop in and take a look, that would be great. And thank you for coming.